When you're building Next.js apps or any app actually, there's a bunch of security pitfalls that you can run into. And you often actually read about it in the news where there's some company that leaked their customer data. So in this video, I want to go over what I think are the most common pitfalls that you really want to avoid so you don't end up in the news losing all of your customer information. So in Next.js, basically this is one Next.js app and we have a client side as well as a server side. So this is going to run in the browser, and typically we're not going to be super concerned with what people are doing with this in the browser. People can change things in the browser. What we are mostly concerned about is what happens on the server, because on the server we are interacting with our database, which is where we have our data, and our data is the most important thing. So what happens on the server is really important because from here is where we interact with that database, where we actually access data. So if a user is able to do something on our server that we don't want, that's a big problem for us. So whenever there's an incoming request to our server side, and that could be for a server component, right? RSC, React Server Component. But these days we also have server actions, and we still have these route handlers, basically your API routes as well. Your Next.js server is going to receive requests for these three. So with any incoming request, we want to do certain things so that we can really make sure that whatever is entering our server or whatever is leaving our server in terms of data is exactly what we want, and there's no room for any malicious users or mistakes. So we can do a lot of things ourselves. The sponsor of today, Arcjet, has a really nice SDK actually that I came across, and they make it very easy to, for example, do rate limiting. We'll talk a little bit about it as well. Also detect bots, right? There's going to be a bunch of bots scraping your site. Also things like email validation. We not only want to make sure that the user is actually submitting text that is of email format, but also that the email itself, for example, exists or it's active or it has a certain record. And they allow you to do data redaction, for example. So if we don't want to send back everything to the client, we can redact something. They actually have a really nice SDK to make certain things easier. They have a shield to protect you from very common attacks like XSS attack. We'll talk all about what that means. What is that? So let's start with our Next.js server. When there's an incoming request to our server for either of these three things, what do we want to do? All right. So the first example that I want to show you has to do with server actions, because this has actually become a really important part of your Next.js server because it's the preferred way of updating data, right? So whenever you need to do like your traditional post, put or delete requests, typically these days you're going to use a server action or server function for those situations. So just to give you an example of that, let's say we have a form here to sign up for a newsletter, right? And a user can input their email address. So we can have a page here where we say sign up for our email newsletter. That's this text here. And then we have this form, right? A form just has an input here. That's what we see here, and a button. Now, the interesting thing here is that we are using a server action, right? So you can use the action attribute and then you can specify a function. This is a sort of a special function. I have defined that in this file. It's currently empty, it's not doing anything, but it's sitting in a file with use server at the top. This is really important because this is creating a so-called server action. And the result of that is now when I submit this form, right, wesley@gmail.com, if I now submit this form, I'm going to receive the form data on my server, actually right here, right? So here I'm gonna get the form data right here, and let's actually log that, console log form data. Form data is actually a bit of a tricky data structure to work with. You have to do like a getter. So now if I open up my terminal and I submit this, you can see I'm getting the data right here on my server side. And just to show you that actually here in my network tab, if we observe what's going on here when I submit that, wesley@gmail.com, if I sign up here, you can see there is still a fetch request happening. We can see it's actually a post request. That's what Next.js is doing automatically for me. And what is it sending with that post request? You can see it's sending that email data with the post request, and the action ID has some identifier, and that's how it gets sent to my server side. Right? There's basically an incoming request to my server side for this server action with that data. And you can also see the route that's being used. So a server action is using the same route as the route on which you're using it. So this is /newsletter. So that's what we have here. So this is basically when a server action, really important, you essentially have a post API endpoint on your server. So technically somebody could make a post request to the same URL and they may be able to trigger this server action and they can submit some data here. So we need to be very careful with this because we may want to interact with our database here, right? So we could use an ORM, let's say, and here when you when we receive an email on the server, we want to update that data in our database and add that email. Be careful because we're interacting with our data here, and technically other people can just make requests to this function and just submit any data they would like. So before you do anything with what we would get here, right, how do we know that this is actually going to be an email? That somebody could just submit maybe some malicious code, maybe like a SQL injection, which would be a real problem if you're using some kind of raw SQL query. It's good to mention that in the latest Next.js, as of recording, that's Next.js 15, they improved the security for server action. So if you have a server action that you are not using, for example, the ID will not be exposed and the ID has been made tricky to guess. But they recommend here you should still treat server actions as public HTTP endpoints, right? So basically like a traditional API endpoint. So we need to protect it in the same way, which means we cannot just assume that this is going to be of type form data. We really don't know what we're going to get here. So if you want to be strict with TypeScript here, for example, we would have to say, well, it's unknown, which means now, if you want to get the email, we cannot just do something like this because we don't even know if it's going to be of that shape form data. Somebody could submit any kind of data to here, some random object, a string, some weird SQL string. We can just do something like this where we first check if it's even an instance of form data. And then we could use something like Zod, check if the data that we're getting into our server side here is actually of the shape that we want it to be, right? So here it should be an object where we just have one email here of email formatting, right? So here we can convert the form data in normal JavaScript objects and we can just check it against that schema. I'm using Zod here, but there are other options. So now only after this do we know for sure that we have an object with email in there, right? But that's not enough because now we just have an object with email in there, right? And that may be shaped of type, with some email formatting. But we don't want to add this to our database. We want to do a little bit more vetting here. So this is where Arcjet actually comes into play. They have a nice email validation option here where we can validate and verify an email address. So this is to prevent users from signing up with fake email addresses or with spammy or fraudulent account. So for example, some users have disposable emails. So basically like a throwaway email address. And there are some legitimate use cases for that, of course, but they're also misused sometimes. Many people have free email accounts. Nothing wrong with that necessarily, of course. Maybe you have a SaaS and you only want professional users to sign up, right? So then they have to use a company account, let's say. So before we actually add it to the database, I want to use Arcjet here to make sure I'm actually getting a proper email. I'm using this in a server action, so Arcjet needs to get access to the headers and cookies. So we just need to do this one line. Then I can say, AJ Arcjet, protect me in this request. Please check this email. And then I'm using this result from Zod, which has been vetted. And then Arcjet will give a decision. Is this a valid one or not? So if it's denied, I can also return out of here. Now I can configure Arcjet up here. So I can instantiate Arcjet here up here as well. So here I can actually instantiate that AJ variable. I just have to pass my API key that I can get from the Arcjet dashboard. Very easy. And here I can specify the rules that I want to use for checking this request, right? So here we're going to check that request. Well, it needs to know what exactly you want to do. So here we want to validate an email and I can have it in live mode or dry run in case I just want Arcjet to log. But here I can specify when it should actually block it, right? So by default, if it's disposable or invalid or no records here, and actually if I use intelligence here, you can see there are some other options as well. So if it doesn't have a gravatar, we can also block it. So that's what we specify here. We get this AJ variable, and that is what I'm using down here, right? So here AJ.protect. And let me actually log the decisions. So now if I try my email, bytegrad@gmail.com, is this a valid email? I'm going to click here and let's see the output here. All right, so here you can see it allowed this particular email and it logs some information. Now let's try a really strange email that we really don't want. I'm gonna click here and let's see what we get as output here. Here you can see it was denied by Arcjet, right? And they will give you a reason, right? So pretty nice. We want to do the same for these other two, right? So we could also get incoming requests still for our route handler. So I could add a route handler here and it works very similar as with page.tsx. Instead of that, we just have a route, right? And typically we still want to have /API in the URL. That's why I'm adding that. That's why I'm creating a folder like that. And it would work the same, right? So maybe we are submitting the email to a route handler instead of a server action. I can use Arcjet here to again validate the email. So if you're doing a post fetch, you would just export a post function here. And then if I want to do some protection here, I can do the same as what we had before. With Arcjet, for example, I would validate an email like this. Now, these days, typically a route handler is used for webhooks, right? So maybe somebody made a payment and Stripe is going to notify your server of that so you can properly update the database and mark them as paying members, let's say. Right, so Stripe is going to notify you of that, and it's called a webhook. How do you know for sure that Stripe is the one that's actually sending that request? That's why you want to do webhook verification. So this is an example from the Stripe documentation. You're going to verify the webhook to make sure it's actually coming from Stripe. And only when you have verified that do you want to update the database. That's mostly how we're using route handlers these days in Next.js. Can a server component get incoming data? And the answer is yes. So a server component, for example, this page component here for the newsletter page, can get, for example, search params. So search params are, for example, things what you see after the question mark. So maybe we have different types of newsletters. This is just going to be the standard one. So if we want to see the newsletter type, we could do something like this to get it from the search params. Since Next.js 15, these search params are asynchronous, so we have to do it a bit awkwardly here with await. Maybe actually I have one for special subscribers. Maybe I want to show something specific to that, and otherwise I just want to show the standard one that we have here. So here I'm going to rely on what I'm getting from the URL, right? But again, you cannot just assume that what you're getting here is safe, because a user can just go to the URL and say, this type is for special subscribers. They can just type that, right? So a user can manipulate these things. And so what you're going to get here as an incoming request, Next.js will send an incoming request. You're going to again have data here that you should vet, right? So here again would be a decent use case for Zalt, for example. Same with params. So params, let me remove this. Let me actually remove all of this. So params is also something you get as a prop here, as incoming data in a server component. And that is when you have those square brackets in the folder name. Yeah, so you have a standard newsletter route, but then you define the type of newsletter right after. So you would have newsletter and then, for example, special, right? So then you would get special as the param. But again, users can just type here. Just because they type something here and press enter, right? If we have an admin newsletter, they can just type admin, press enter. And so you're going to get params here. And based on that, you may do something here. Well, before you do that, make sure that whether the user should have access, right? Maybe there should be some authentication or Zalt to make sure it's the right shape, right? So sometimes you actually have to check for the authentication status of the user in a server component before you do anything with what you're getting here, right? So for example, with Kind, I'm a brand ambassador for them. It's a paid sponsorship, but this is how that would look like. The point is, before you use any of the incoming data params, right, or any other incoming data into your server side, you want to do authentication checks. You want to check for the shape of the data with Zalt, for example, and think about additional protection here with Arcjet. So those were some Next.js specific ones, but there are some really common pitfalls as well. So there is SQL injection, for example. What does that actually mean? You've probably seen it around. So people can type whatever they want, right? So they could actually type an email, but they can also type something like this, john@gmail.com. 1 equals 1. This looks strange. Why would somebody do this? If you are using for example, a raw SQL on your backend, when you get that email, right, when you get that email value, what you may get is, well, what we would get something like this, right? So now the query would be select everything from emails where the email is actually john@gmail.com or 1 equals 1. Well, this is always true. This could return all of the emails from your database because 1 is always 1. Since this is a true statement, essentially. This is always going to be a true statement like this. So it's going to select all the emails. And so if you're doing something like this, where maybe we want to check if the email already exists and you're going to send back the email that was checked. Well, now with this, I would leak all the emails I have in my database. That's SQL injection. And Arcjet offers the Arcjet shield option as well. I'll show you that in a second. The other very common vulnerability is XSS attack. So this happens when you allow users to submit content. So this is one of the course projects that we did. So basically people can submit something here, very common in social media, feed type of applications. Right, so if I type something here, hello, ByteGrad, I will submit here. You can see it's added to the feed here. So now when other people go to this app, they will also see this. Now the danger here is somebody could write something like a script tag, right? So they could write something like transfer money, right? Something like this. So basically they are submitting some content to our database, right? They're going to submit it to our server here, where when somebody else comes to our page, we are going to show this list, right? With that message that they submitted. But now we are going to insert a script tag on that other user's page. right? And if we are not properly sanitizing this, we may run the risk that this script actually gets executed. And there is some fetch request, some network request going to, well, maybe the bank that they're using to transfer money. And that is especially common when you have like a feed where you have a list of items here, and you're going to use the inner HTML feature to actually render that. In React, it's actually called dangerous inner HTML. And actually you can see Copilot already gives me a XSS suggestion, right? So this is actually really dangerous, right? So you want to be very careful with getting user content and then displaying that user content for other users, because you need to sanitize that what you're going to get. You need to sanitize that the content that you're going to get on your server when they submit it is properly sanitized. This is also something that Arcjet Shield can help with. So not only the SQL injection, but also the XSS attack. Another one is CSRF attack. You've probably heard of that one as well. It's a bit of a complicated one, but let's say you have some user and they're going to get some email, a phishing email perhaps, and they click on the link in the email. So they will go to a website that was created by a scammer, the scammer's website. They click the link and now they're on a scammer's website. Now, on that scammer's website, they may also perform a fetch request to our server, let's say. Maybe we are actually a banking app, right? So this script is part of that website, and that will make a network request to our server, right? Where that user is registered, and that will trigger let's say a money transfer. Well, you may say, oh, that's not a problem because we are still going, when the incoming request hits our server, we're going to check if the user is logged in. But the way it works with authentication is it works with cookies, and cookies are sent automatically with the request. So if that user was already logged in to our app and they click that link in that phishing email, when they land on this website, the scammer is executing that script as part of that website, those cookies will be sent with the request. So from our perspective, there's just an incoming request from an authenticated user. This is a more complicated one, CSRF. And one of the things you want to do is, for example, cookies is when you set cookies, you want to make sure it's only for the same site, right? So they will only be sent when it's actually on our website, not on the scammer's website. And what you also want to do is if there's an important action being taken, for example, transferring money, you want to pop up like a dialogue and make sure the user types in their password again, for example. And actually there's an organization called OWASP, and they list every few years the most common attacks. They have this new list here. You can see injection here, and we can try using Arcjet Shield here to protect against many of those on the list. So Arcjet allows us to do that for an individual route or for middleware. I would say middleware is probably a little bit more attractive because we want to do it for all requests, not just an individual request, right? So middleware is essentially sitting in between any incoming request. Basically, we can make it so that for any incoming request to our server, it first goes through middleware. So we can already do something with the request before we really do anything serious in our application. So here in the root of this source folder, I'm going to create a middleware.ts file. And here, for example, I can use Arcjet. I can instantiate Arcjet here. I can use the shield option as a rule now, right? So here I can use shield, just very simple. One thing we just have to include as a rule here, export that. And now I have Arcjet Shield checking basically every request, right? Not for static assets and some other ones, right? But for example, if there is an incoming request for a route handler or server action or server component, I now have Arcjet Shield actually, which is very easy to set up. And so I think that's definitely something to consider using. All right, so the next one I see all the time, especially with junior developers. And in all honesty, it is an easy mistake to make, but it's actually very dangerous. So let's say we have an unsubscribe button on the page as well, right? So I could just have basically a delete button, right? We want to delete the email from the email list. So I just have a delete button, and it's just a component here. You can see when I click on the button, I'm actually invoking a server action again, right? I can do that like this, no problem. So here I have my server action and I'm submitting the email that needs to be deleted. Here we will get some email, and here then I'm using my ORM to actually delete data. Now we learned before that this is dangerous, right? Because this is some data that we're going to receive on the server side. And since it's just like an API endpoint, anyone can just send some random data. So we need to properly validate here. And let's say that the validation is going well. So we know that there is actually an email, it's the proper structure. So now what? Can we just delete the email? Well, no, maybe only logged in users can delete email. So we want an authentication step here as well. Right, so here we want to check that the user is actually logged in. Otherwise, we don't want to allow this. Only logged in user can delete their email. Okay, so now it's safe. We validated the email. We have authentication. Now for sure we can delete the email safely, right? And actually, no, this is still not enough. How do we know that the email that is being deleted, the resource that's being deleted, logged in user actually has control, has access to that, right? So just checking if a user is logged in, that just means that they have like a JSON web token in the cookies, that they have some identifier perhaps, they are logged in. It doesn't mean that they have access to the resource that's being deleted. So don't forget about the authorization check, right? So a user can only delete it if it's their own email, right? So here we want to check if the user.email is not what is being deleted here. Well, we also want to return here, right? Very common mistake, actually. I would say this is a very, very common one, because by default, people often think about these two, but we also want to double check that whoever is making this request is allowed to do that. And actually, if you look at the number one security risk from OWASP, you can see it's actually broken access control, similar to what I showed you here, right? So don't forget about that. All right, so those were issues that we could have when there's incoming requests to our server side, and there's going to be some piece of data in there that we need to double check. Basically at the code level, we need to check something. But there's another problem, which is somebody could send many requests. They could send millions of requests in short time, and this could be a problem. So there is something called denial of service, DDoS, and denial of wallet as well, especially for serverless applications, which is often how you host Next.js apps, which basically means there's going to be so many requests, and since it's a serverless function, you're paying for each invocation of a serverless function. So it could become very expensive if you don't have a way to stop that. So typically we want to do some rate limiting, as it's called. It's easy to do rate limiting by using a third party that offers rate limiting out of the box. So Arcjet offers rate limiting as well. We can do it on a specific route, or we can do it in a middleware, and then we can do it essentially for our whole app, or almost all requests. So we can just add something here to the rules, and here we can specify in 1 hour you can have at most 60 requests, let's say. All right, let's actually try this. Let's say in 1 hour I can only make 2 requests. So I just refreshed, so that was 1. And I'm refreshing again, that was 2. Now I'm refreshing again. And you can see we now get this error message because we are rate limited, and Arcjet is protecting our app from too many requests. Right now, 2 would not be a realistic number. 60, I would say, is still on the low side. Depends on your exact use case. You can get very granular with this. You can define it per route or which algorithm to use. Arcjet actually offers 3 different algorithms that you can use. The fixed window is just the easiest one, how many in 1 minute, for example. But there's also sliding window and token bucket. So I like to have some kind of rate limiting in my setup for sure. And something else that you may want to pay attention to as well is bot protection. So you're going to have, especially if you have valuable data, there's going to be other people that will try to scrape your website, for example, or they're just making random requests, prodding your server essentially for vulnerabilities. This is why sometimes if you host an app, for example, you can see these weird requests for, let's say, WordPress admin, or that's basically just a bot checking for servers that may have some vulnerability. A lot of the bots as well will be like search engines like Google as well. Now, Arcjet allows you to protect against this as well. So I can add here detect bot, and I can specify allow or deny lists. So I can allow all the bots that belong to the category search engine. And I actually have a list of bots that you may run into. So here actually you can see there's a huge list of bots that may be scanning, that may make requests to your website. They belong to different categories here. So a lot of them are going to be for search engines. But you can see there are other types of bots as well, and you may decide to block them. So what we just discussed is incoming requests to your server. And usually those requests have data in them. So basically incoming data into our server. What about, for example, incoming data into the client side, let's say local storage? Well, you may want to use Zod for that as well. But again, on the client side, we are not directly interacting with our database typically. So it's not as important as the server where we are actually accessing data. So that's all about incoming data. Now, what about outgoing data? How do we prevent leaking data? All right, so maybe we're using an external service for hosting our subscriber data, basically just a third-party service, and we have our API key, right? That's going to be some secret that we don't want other people to see. Now, it's fine to use it like this in a server component, But what often also happens is that you create utility functions, right? Because maybe we're not only doing it in this place, but also in other places. So you create some utils file and you move it away from here. And we create a function, something like this, return data, right? Something like this, right? And then if you want to get the subscriber emails, you would just invoke it somewhere like this. Now, this is fine, but what happens if you or somebody else on your team uses this function not in a server component, but in a client component? Remember, we have the delete button here. What if somebody is using this, let's say here in a client component? What happens if I use it here? Well, so now if I go here, let's take a look. You can go to sources here, and now here, if I search for secret string, you can see that this is actually part. Now I can access this here in the browser, right? I don't want to expose this secret string. That's my API key. This should stay on the server, right? So we don't want to be able to use this in client component. So here is where we can use the server only package. If we just import it like this, now if you try using this in a client component, now if I go back here, you can see I'm getting an error and I can fix my mistake, right? You're importing something that needs server only, right? So I see a lot of people, they get confused with import server only. This is different from use server, right? Use server is creating a server action, basically like an API endpoint on our server, which is a pretty big deal. This is something you want to be very careful with. But import server only is just like a handy utility that you can use to make sure that you get an error in case you decide to use this on the client side, right? This is not mandatory. I would say it's more optional, but it's very useful because if you try using it in a client component, you're gonna get a nice error. A component doesn't only become a client component if it has use client at the top, it also becomes a client component if it's imported in another component that is a client component, right? So it may not even have use client at the top. So you may think, oh, it's a server component, but it's actually a client component, right? Because it's being imported somewhere else. That's already a client component. So what I like to do is actually add this, but also name the file server utils to make it clear for everyone. These are utility functions that we use only on the server side. So that can be anywhere in server components or server actions or these route handlers. Now, even if you don't use that, Next.js has some additional built-in protection. So actually, typically you would have an API key, not, as a string here. You would have it as part of your environment variables, right? So here I could have an API key and I would use it like this. So here I would have API key process.env API key, right? If you do it like this, you use it in a client component. Now, if I try to find secret string, I cannot find it, right? So Next.js has some sort of built-in protection for environment variables. So an environment variable will not be sent to the browser like this. If you want to send an environment variable to the browser, you have to be explicit about it and you have to add next public, right? So then if I would change it to that, now if I again would do it like this, now if I try to search for it again, now I can find it again here in the browser, right? So be careful with next public. Only when it's okay to be exposed to the client is when you want to add that. All right, last one I want to show you here has to do with fetching data. This is actually a really tricky one. What if I have an admin dashboard and here for the admin, I want to show all the emails from our database, right? So we could get all the emails from our database like this on that page. This is a page component. I just created this page as part of my file system. And let's say we get these emails from our database and then we are simply mapping over that here. So is this safe? Well, no, right now anybody can just type in admin in the URL and go here, right? So you could say, well, we need authentication and authorization, and that is correct, right? So I could add something like this. So first check if the user is actually logged in, and then actually make sure that they are an admin. And only after that are we going to make, let's say, a database query with Prisma and render that on the page. In this case, this would be fine to do. Now, what is the risk here? Well, the risk is that I'm doing it directly on the page here, in the page component here, but we may actually create a separate component for that. I could create, let's say, an email list component, email list, and I'm going to do the data fetching in that component directly. So not on the page anymore, but I'm going to do it in this page component here. This is also a server in this component here. This is also a server component. And again, we can just make a database query here and render a list. So we're going to refactor this a little bit. We're just going to create a separate component out of this to clean things up a little bit, right? That's the typical React way. And then instead of this, we would have this. So it looks cleaner actually. What is the problem with this? Is this an issue? Right now, this would work the same as before. This would be fine to do. But the risk with this is that you or somebody else, a React developer, what are they thinking about? They're thinking about reusability. So they may reuse this component. This admin page is protected, but somebody else could maybe use it on a public page. Let's say the home page that we have here. Somebody may use this component on a public page. So now if I go to the home page, you can see I have all this data here on a public route now. I have leaked all my emails. And that is because a very easy mistake to make, but there is a gap between where you do the authentication check and where you are actually accessing the data, right? So we are accessing the data in a separate component. So there's a gap. And because of that, there is some risk that you could reuse this component on a public route. So Next.js actually recommends that you use a data access layer recommended for new projects. So what I can do here is I can just call it data access, and this is going to be for my emails, let's say, email access. And here I can create a dedicated function for getting emails. So here I would then have the authentication check, the authorization check, and here is where I would actually interact with my database. Let's say we're getting these emails, and that's what I would return from this function, return emails. So now whenever I want to get the emails, I have to use this particular function. So it doesn't matter now if I use it in this component, right, or anywhere else where I want to use it, because now if I use it like this, it doesn't matter where I use this component, because to get the actual emails, I have to call this function. And in all of these functions in my data access layer, I'm doing the authentication check. I'm doing the check as close as possible to where I'm actually interacting with my database. So there is no gap in between there that can cause any issues. Right? I can add import server only at the top, so I cannot use this in client component. And so in this file, I would have all the functions where I would actually interact with my database. And then in my React components, I would only use these functions with the authentication checks in there to access data, right? So I could also create a function for updating or deleting all your CRUD actions. So I think that's a better way of structuring your application. In any case, I hope that you learned something from this video. Next.js introduces some new patterns, so it's okay if you're a little bit confused. I've actually really enjoyed working with Arcjet so far, so I would say check them out as well. You can find a link in the description. They have a nice dashboard here where you can also see the history of decisions that Arcjet made, right? So I had some testing here. You can see that Arcjet did some rate limiting for me, and I can see how many requests Arcjet was involved in, including the routes. So I want to thank Arcjet for sponsoring this video, and I want to thank you for watching this video. Have a nice day. Bye.